Welcome back to part 2 of this week's webinar in the subject of Science Assumes and Torah Knows. On Monday we discussed that when there's a conflict between science and Torah, a believing Jew is not so bothered because at the end of the day, even scientific proof is not full proof. In fact, no logic is. Torah, on the other hand, is divine, which is, of course, 100% true. If we can resolve the conflict between Torah and science without changing even one iota what Torah has to say, then why not? It doesn't hurt. But if we can't, then it should not bother me, because once again, science just assumes, Torah knows for sure. Which leads us into today's idea, today's topic, the age and the creation of the world. Science has proven that the world has started with a big bang and is billions of years old. How does that fit with Torah's account that the world was created in 6 days by God 5,777 years ago? A great conflict, a big contradiction. There are those who have tried to reconcile this and explain that the 6 days of creation that the Torah describes are not 24-hour periods. In other words, are not regular days that we know of. Rather, they were really billions of years. And this way of explaining it is all based on Einstein's theory of relativity, that there could be different ways of passing time depending on where you are, how fast you're going, etc., etc. For honesty's sake, I will say that I do not fully understand the details of this theory and this explanation. However, it is actually irrelevant to our discussion because I'm not here to disprove that theory or to show how it's not logically correct. My issue is more saying that that is what Torah has to say. My issue is more saying that that is in fact what Torah is saying, that the 6 days weren't really 24-hour regular days, rather billions of years, and somehow working how those two things work together. First of all, how do we know what Torah means? Torah sometimes is very cryptic, sometimes it's not so understood. And of course, the first place to look in are on the commentaries of the Torah. Famous commentaries like Rashi or the Ramban or the Rambam, the various commentaries, the various great authorities, halachic authorities that have been over the generations. The vast majority of the commentaries on the Torah, including the Ramban, Nachmanides, explain that the 6 days of creation mean 24-hour days, exactly the way that we know of a day. Another very important point here is based on what we know as, in Hebrew, Mesorah. Mesorah means tradition. This may sound silly, but how were our grandparents taught when they went to cheder, when they went to school? How would they explain the 6 days of creation? How have virtually all Jews throughout all the generations understood what the Torah has said, that the world has been created in 6 days? They have understood it. Vayi erev, vayi boiker, yom echad, that it was morning and it was evening and then morning one day, meaning 24 hours. That is the way it has been understood throughout all the generation by most of the Jewish people. Now, that may sound silly and not a very good proof that that's what Torah meant, but in fact, Mesorah is not just tradition, it's holy tradition. We are told that the Jewish people as a whole have what's called collective prophecy. In general, when Jewish people as a whole have accepted something, either have accepted a certain way of learning, or a certain way of understanding Torah, or even a certain custom, we are told that that is a form of prophecy, that is actually the correct way of understanding the Torah. This is so much so that even if, yes, there might be a source, one source or two sources that say otherwise, but nevertheless, since this is the Mesorah, this is the way it's been taught, this is the way we know of it for the past thousands of years, we can assume and we know, almost know for 100% sure, that this is the correct way of learning it. Let me bring you an example, a fascinating example that might need a shir on its own to explain, but it's a good example for the point that we want to bring out today. The Rambam, Maimonides, says that somebody who believes that God has a body is what he calls a min, which basically means a heretic. It is heresy to believe that God has a body. Obviously, God is infinite and does not have any characteristics of a human being. The Rambam then goes on to say that the Torah, we find many verses in the Torah that sort of describe God as Einei Hashem, the eyes of God, or Oznei Hashem, the ears of God. He says that's all an analogy and that does not mean at all on a literal sense. The Ravid, a great Torah sage who lived in the same generation as the Rambam, and he is known for arguing with the Rambam on a lot of issues, says that how can you call such a person a heretic? And he uses a fascinating expression. He says there were Gdoilim v'Toivim. There were many great and good Jews who understood that God understood these verses on a literal sense. Now, to explain what the Ravid means and what those people thought is for a different time. However, is there any believing Jew today who will have the audacity to say that God has a body? I can find you a source. I have the Ravid, a great Torah sage, says that there were Gedolim v'Toivim, great Jews who thought and believed that Einei Hashem, the eyes of God, means literally. But we don't say that, because that's not the Messiah, that is not your tradition, that is not the way Jews have been taught, that is not what Jews have believed over thousands of years. We obviously believe that God transcends all of those type of things. The same thing applies to our topic. The 6 days of creation over all the generations for thousands of years has been understood as 6 days literally. Why would we change that? And how can we change that? Moving on to the next point. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, who we mentioned last week, was both knowledgeable in Torah and science, strongly opposed the notion that the 6 days of creation is not literal and really is just 6 eras spanning over billions of years. And I would like to summarize the point that he brings across in two points. Number one, he wants to say that why is there a need to change the Torah from its literal meaning in this idea of 6 days of creation? What's wrong with explaining it literally? Because this brings us back to our original point, that scientific proofs are just assumptions. There is absolutely no way of proving beyond the shadow of a doubt, 100%, that God didn't create the world in a way that it has the characteristics of something that has been around for 6 billion years. God, by definition, is infinite and can create things that are old. So when we're talking about God, there is no reason to take the Torah out of context and to explain it differently. It requires the same infinite power to create something new than to create something that appears and can be proven, so to speak, that is old. So once again, I'm not disproving this theory. We're just saying that when dealing with God, this theory cannot be proven. When dealing with an infinite God, if we believe that God created the world, then the proof cannot be proven beyond the shadow of a doubt. Because who's to say that God didn't create a world that has all the characteristics, and if experiments are done with it, will come out to look like as if it's 6 billions of years old. However, the Rebbe continues that it's not only that there's no reason to change the Torah from the literal meaning, in fact, there's a very strong reason not to take the Torah out of context and to change it from its literal meaning. And he brings 2 very almost simple and obvious proofs. We all keep Shabbos. Shabbos is the 7th day of the week. Why do we keep Shabbos? Why do we celebrate the 7th day of the week? Because as the verse tells us, in 6 days God created the heaven and the earth, and he rested on the 7th. In other words, God worked for 6 days, we worked for 6 days. God rested on the 7th, we rest on the 7th to commemorate that. If God in fact did not work for 6 days, but worked for billions of years, and the seventh refers to billions of years later, then Shabbos would have to be every billions of years. Every billions of years, after some billions of years, we will then celebrate the seventh day of Shabbos. The fact that we don't do that, the fact that we only work for 6 days and rest on the seventh, proves that when the Torah tells us that God worked for 6 days, it means exactly the same type of 6 days that we are working. Another very interesting halachic proof. In Jewish documents, such as a ksuba, a marriage document, a divorce document, we write the date, and we date the world to be 5,777 years. In some of these documents, if there is one detail that is incorrect, that then renders the document invalid. If we write on our documents that the world is 5,770 years old, and that is inaccurate, then all of our documents, a lot of these documents, would be invalid. The fact that we write it this way means that it is literally this way. Now, after all said and done, this is not to say that science is necessarily essentially a bad thing. Science is human intellect. Human intellect was created by God to use. Of course, we should try and discover what we can know about the universe and about the world based on the way we understand things. And in fact, the more we do that, the more we become aware of God's greatness in His creation. It's just that if the human intellect leads us to believe something that is contrary to God's way of understanding it, then I will choose what the inventor has to say rather what the consumer has to say. I will rather rely on the creator of the world, that He knows His world better than the inhabitants, the people that live in it. I'm just going to end off with a final phenomenal point. That although, yes, there are contradictions between Torah and science, however, as we get closer to the coming of Mashiach, we find that science is actually, in a way, moving closer to Torah than moving further away from it. And I'll bring 2 examples. The very fact that the world began. People have always believed that the world was just forever. The fact that science has proven that the world began at some point is actually a step closer to realizing that there's a creator of the world. Yes, they haven't got to that point yet, but I guarantee you, one day they will. And another very interesting point is the fact that everything is made up of atoms. In Torah, it explains that not only did God create the world once, 5,777 years ago, but in fact, God keeps on creating the world every single second. The way the world is still in existence is because there's a godly force in every single creation. Comes out that the true existence of every single creation is really the same, is God. God is what gives every single creation its existence. The fact that science has discovered that really everything is just made out of atoms, the unity within the creation, is a step closer to realizing the godliness within every single creation, which actually unites all the creations together. They have found the atoms, and please God, very soon, Mashiach will come. We will find the godliness within the entire creation, when the entire world will realize the one true God. Have a good day.